Somewhere in the archaeological record of human prehistory, buried under layers of stone tools, animal bones, and cave paintings, there is a question that almost no researcher thought to ask for most of the history of science. When did humans first start falling in love? Not when did they start reproducing, which is a biological question with a clear mechanical answer. Not when did they start forming pair bonds for strategic survival purposes, which is an anthropological question with a reasonably well-documented answer. But when did something that felt recognizably like love, the specific consuming, slightly irrational attachment to one particular person above all others, first appear in a human mind? The answer turns out to be far older than written poetry, far older than marriage rituals, far older than any cultural institution that has ever tried to contain or celebrate the feeling. The first thing that makes this question genuinely hard to answer is that love leaves almost no physical trace in the fossil record. You can find the bones of the people who felt it. You can find the tools they made and the animals they ate, and occasionally the pigments they used to make art on cave walls. What you cannot find is a fossilized emotion, a preserved feeling, a hardened remnant of whatever was happening neurochemically in a brain that has long since turned to dust. This is why scientists approaching the evolutionary origins of love have to work sideways, building their case from indirect evidence. The comparative biology of other primates, the anatomy and physiology of the human bonding system, the neurochemistry of attachment, the patterns of behavior observed in modern hunter-gatherer societies. To understand when love appeared in the human lineage, it helps enormously to understand why it appeared at all. Because love, in evolutionary terms, is not a given. It is expensive, disruptive, and in some ways actively counterproductive to simple reproductive efficiency. A purely reproductive strategy from an evolutionary standpoint would favor maximizing the number of offspring with the maximum number of partners, not developing an intense, exclusive attachment to one specific individual that causes loss of appetite, impaired concentration, elevated stress hormones, and in some cases, complete behavioral dysfunction when the attachment is threatened or lost. The fact that this costly consuming emotional state exists at all, and exists universally across every human culture ever studied, with no exceptions, means evolution kept it around for a reason. The biological story starts with a transition in mating strategy that researchers can actually trace through comparative anatomy. Among great apes, our closest relatives, mating systems vary considerably. Gorillas live in harem-based systems dominated by a single large male. Chimpanzees live in multi-male, multi-female groups with considerable promiscuity and a great deal of male-male competition. What's notable about both systems is that neither involves anything resembling extended, exclusive male investment in a specific female or her offspring. Male chimps and gorillas provide essentially no direct parental care to their young. The shift towards something more like pair bonding in the human lineage appears to correlate closely with a specific anatomical change that shows up clearly in the fossil record. The dramatic reduction in male body size relative to female body size, or what biologists call reduced sexual dimorphism. In species where males compete intensely for access to multiple females, males tend to be dramatically larger than females because size wins fights. Early in the hominin fossil record, sexual dimorphism was high, consistent with a mating system involving significant male-male competition. But as the hominin lineage progresses toward Homo erectus and eventually modern Homo sapiens, the size difference between males and females shrinks considerably. But why would that shift happen? The leading explanation connects directly to the specific demands of raising human children, who are by any biological measure among the most helpless and demanding offspring produced by any species on Earth. A human infant is born so neurologically undeveloped, so completely dependent, and so slow to reach independence compared to the offspring of any other primate that raising one successfully in a dangerous prehistoric environment required a level of investment that a single mother could not reliably provide alone. A female with a dependent infant and possibly another young child was dramatically more vulnerable to predation, starvation, and the general dangers of life on the open savanna if she had no reliable provisioner helping to bring food while she was nursing and caring for an infant. The evolutionary logic of pair bonding follows directly from this. A male who formed a stable, preferential attachment to a specific female and reliably provisioned her, and their offspring would, over time, produce more surviving children than a male who spread his attention thinly and invested reliably in none of his offspring at all. The neurochemistry that makes romantic love feel the way it does appears to be an adaptation built specifically to lock in this arrangement, creating a motivational state powerful enough to override the competing drives toward variety and self-interest that would otherwise undermine stable pair bonding. The neurotransmitters and hormones involved in romantic love, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and eventually the bonding hormones oxytocin and vasopressin that convert early-stage romantic obsession into longer-term attachment, are not unique to humans, but the specific pattern in which they are deployed and the behavioral outcomes they produce in humans appear to be distinct from what's observed in other primates. Oxytocin and vasopressin in particular, the chemicals most directly associated with long-term bonding and pair maintenance, have been studied extensively in voles, small rodents that show an unusually strong pair bonding behavior for mammals. The prairie vole bonds for life and shows clear distress when separated from its partner. The closely related meadow vole, with a slightly different distribution of vasopressin receptors in its brain, shows no such attachment and mates promiscuously. The difference between a loving bond and casual reproduction, at least in voles, appears to come down to where specific neurochemical receptors are located in the brain, a finding that has obvious and somewhat humbling implications for thinking about human romantic attachment. If the neurological machinery for love was being built by evolutionary pressure associated with pair bonding and cooperative child rearing, the question of when this began maps fairly closely onto the question of when extended biparental care became essential to human child rearing, which most researchers place somewhere in the vicinity of Homo erectus, around 1.5 to 2 million years ago. This is the period when human offspring were becoming significantly more neurologically demanding, when the increase in brain size was creating longer developmental periods, and when the specific vulnerability of human infants was increasing to the point that reliable male provisioning would have had the most significant survival effect. This doesn't mean Homo erectus was writing love poems or experiencing romantic passion in the way modern humans recognize it. But it does suggest that the neurological and behavioral foundations of selective emotional attachment to a specific partner, the system that in modern humans produces everything from the early obsessive stage of falling in love to the quiet long-term attachment of a decades-long partnership, were likely beginning to be assembled in the human brain during this period. The earliest physical evidence that something resembling love or intense personal attachment was being expressed between specific individuals comes from burial practices, which appear in the archaeological record with increasing frequency and personal specificity, beginning around 100,000 years ago, at a site in what is now Israel, dating to approximately 12,000 years ago. Archaeologists discovered the burial of a young woman whose body had been carefully positioned and whose grave had been filled with the remains of over 50 tortoise shells, a wing from a golden eagle, the tail of a cow, the foot of a wild boar, and the skulls and limbs of several other animals. A collection that seems almost impossible to interpret as anything other than the product of someone who cared profoundly and specifically about this particular individual and wanted that care to persist beyond her death. But perhaps the most arresting ancient evidence comes from a burial at a site called Ain Ghazal in Jordan, where two people were buried together in a single grave, their hands intertwined, in a position that has been described by the researchers who found them as unmistakably deliberate, as if whoever placed them there wanted to ensure they remained connected even in death. What the full picture suggests is that love, in something approaching its modern neurological and emotional form, is not a recent invention layered on top of human biology by culture or civilization. It is far older, far more biological, and far more directly connected to the specific survival demands of the human developmental strategy than most romantic accounts of it acknowledge. The feeling that makes a person unable to stop thinking about one specific other person, that makes their presence feel like relief and their absence feel like deprivation, that produces the specific obsessive quality of early romantic attachment. This was not invented by poets or novelists or the writers of romantic songs. It was built, piece by neurochemical piece, by the same brutal evolutionary pressure that built every other feature of the human body. The pressure to survive, to reproduce successfully, and to keep the extraordinarily vulnerable, extraordinarily expensive children of this particular species alive long enough to do the same. Love, it turns out, is not a luxury. It may be one of the oldest and most necessary things we have ever had.